Okay, so we can get started. Can all of you hear me? Yep, okay, great. So we are pleased to welcome everyone today. Thank you for coming to this event sponsored by the Menard Family Initiative at University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. And this is actually the second event of the spring semester. This was supposed to be the first event of the spring semester way back in February, which we had to reschedule thanks to the lovely Wisconsin weather. But here we are, we made it happen. So I am Nabumita Duda. I go by Mita quite a bit. I'm a professor of economics at the College of Business and the co-director of Menard Family Initiative. The other co-director of the MFI is Adam Stivers, who is in the finance department, an associate professor and the chair of finance. We have, events also planned for fall 2023, which you will hear as we start promoting them in fall, and we hope that you join us in the future as well. So, I'll just give you a few lines about what is our overall broad goal with the Menard Family Initiative. And it basically is to engage in discussions and offer enriching experiences to students, faculty, and the community, such as the one we have here today. This is not all the topics I'm going to mention, but some of the topics we are emphasizing are, free speech, capitalism, and free markets, and the implications of those on economic outcomes, and for societies in general, and also entrepreneurship, which was the theme of the first event we had. Before I pass this on to Adam, Adam will introduce our eminent speaker today here, Professor Timur Kuran. But before that, I definitely want to, I don't know where she is, but I want to thank, oh, there she is, Callie, our outreach specialist. We couldn't have done this without her. We also want to thank Paige, our student worker, and both of them, immense help, supported us all through doing every logistic work. And I don't think she's here, but every time we couldn't figure out a solution, we ran to Mary Grattan, who is in the dean's office, who used to our previous econ ADA. And so when we didn't figure out a solution, we ran to her. So I want to thank her, but I don't think she's here today. One last thing, before I give this to Adam, is all of you students here, you have gotten an email, was it yesterday, Adam? Sent from the MFI. It's student fellows, which we are recruiting 2 student fellows next fall. So you can send in applications. All details are mentioned in the email. If you have questions, send a question to that email. The incentive, it comes with a $10,000 scholarship, okay? So that's your incentive. So maybe don't delete the email. So you can read through it, okay? Okay, welcome everyone. I'll just...
All right, thank you, Mita. I guess in addition to thanking Callie and Paige and Mary Groton at the Dean's office, also want to thank the Menard family for their continued support to the Menard Family Initiative. Also want to thank Timur. Many of you know that he was supposed to come in February, and we had a huge snowstorm. We spent all day with him sort of in a holding pattern, wondering, is he coming or not? Is he going to make it or not? We ultimately rescheduled. Then he had a flight delay and missed his flight to La Crosse yesterday. And so he's been very patient with us, and we're just glad that he went through all that to be here. We're very lucky to have such a well-known scholar in this area here at UWL, so I'm glad that you all have shown up to hear what he'll have to say. A couple other things. So depending on the time that we have, if you want to go ahead and scan this QR code now, that this will be what we use for questions at the end. So if you can pull this up now, and as we go, if you have questions, At the end, we should have time for a couple questions that we can read out. Um, right. I also want to mention that after this talk, over in Whittick Hall on the second floor, we'll have a reception, so some food and drinks. Please come. Also, if you didn't get a chance to have your question answered, that would be another opportunity to come over to the reception and continue the discussion. Okay. So with that, as I mentioned, this is a very well-known scholar, so I have lots of things to say as I introduce. So Timur Kuran is professor of economics and political science and Gorder Family Professor of Islamic Studies at Duke University. His most recent book is on the historical reasons why the Middle East is the world's most repressive region, titled Freedoms Delayed, The Political Legacy of Islamic Law in the Middle East. That's slated for production July of this year. Among his other publications are Islam and Aman, The Economic Predicaments of Islamism, and The Long Divergence, How Islamic Law Held Back the Middle East, and Private Truths, Public Lies, The Social Consequences of Preference Falsification. All have been translated into multiple languages. The last book that I mentioned provides a theory of how preference falsification, which is the act of misrepresenting one's wants under perceived social pressures, distorts human knowledge, and conceals political possibilities. He is at work on a sequel to this book, which focuses on the role that preference falsification plays in political polarization in the United States and elsewhere. Professor Kuran currently directs the Association for Analytical Learning about Islam and Muslim societies. He co-edits a book series for Cambridge University Press titled Economics, Choice, and Society. He also co-edits the Journal of Comparative Economics and serves on numerous editorial boards. As a promoter of expressive freedoms, Professor Kuran is a founding member of the AFA, the Academic Freedom Alliance, and he serves on the advisory council of the FIRE, which stands for Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Professor Kuran earned an AB from Princeton University and an MA and PhD from Stanford University, all in economics. So please join me in welcoming Professor Timur Kuran. Give it a test.
Okay, yeah. Test. I guess
Everybody-
everyone can hear me? Okay,
Should we move
good.
it closer? Or?
Okay, you want to move it closer? Go ahead. And should we? Will that work? I think you can hear me. Okay. And we can switch. Okay, this is good. Well, many thanks to the organizers, Professors Duta and Stivers, for the invitation, and it's an honor to be part of the activities of the Menard Family Initiative. Serendipitously, I'm speaking on the eve of an Islamic festival, the Eid that marks the end of Ramadan, which is the month of fasting for Muslims. Throughout the Muslim world, people are preoccupied by various nagging problems of their societies. I'm going to focus on one, which is illiberal strains within Islam and the potential for political liberalization, religious liberalization in particular, in the Middle East. There's much pessimism on this issues, on the issue of the liberalization of Islam among Muslims. In private, they will tell you this, though much less frequently in public. I'm going to focus mostly on the empty parts of the glass, but I'm also going to point out that the glass is a lot fuller than people appreciate on the basis of news from the region. Now, speaking of news, consider recent news from Iran. Half a year ago, in September, a woman named Mahsa Amini died in police custody. Why was she in police custody in the first place? Why was she almost certainly tortured. This was because she dared to appear in public without a headscarf. Iran is a theocracy. It is a country that is ruled by clerics, and they enforce various religious rules according to their understanding of Islam. A decade earlier, ISIS burst onto the world stage. It was at the headlines for months. It occupied an area that covers about half of Syria and half of Iraq. It beheaded lots of people in front of cameras for misbehaving according to their understandings of Islam. Now, such news stories convey the impression that Islam is inherently repressive and inherently illiberal. Indeed, whenever episodes like this hit the news, you see just a torrent of opinions, books, other writings that treat Islam as an incorrigibly violent religion, as a religion that treats women as second-class people, and that gender inequalities are hopelessly embedded in the religion. Now, such interpretations are not new. They were quite common in the 19th century, and they've not been limited to extremists in the West. In the Middle East, growing numbers, as I pointed out, make these points. Now, I'm going to suggest that Islam is not incorrigibly repressive. Yes, it has its intolerant strains. Yes, it has violent branches, but Islam is not static. It has changed a lot more than people appreciate over the past couple of centuries. It continues to be in flux. For all the hideous stories that go viral, there's major institutional progress that is making religious liberalization increasingly likely. The glass cannot fill up in a flash, but it was never empty, and it's less empty now than it was. So let's see what has made it fuller now than, say, 2 centuries ago, and also let's see why the glass hasn't filled up as rapidly as many liberals hope. I should point out that I'm using liberalism in the classical sense, not in the American sense, which typically is a buzzword for politically blue. That is not the sense in which I'm using it. I'm using liberal in the sense of promoting individual rights, civil liberties, expressive liberties. My focus is going to be on the Middle East, which I'm defining as the entire Arab world, including North Africa, plus Iran and Turkey. This is the, see if this is going to work on the screen. Oh, it does, yeah. So this is a dark green area. This is what I'm focusing on. The areas, all of the green areas, including the light green ones, are members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So this is essentially the Muslim world. The Middle East stands out even within the Organization of Islamic Cooperation as a particularly repressive region, according to dozens of indices. Civil liberties are unusually weak by global standards, also by the standards of OIC. The press is relatively unfree. The internet is relatively unfree. Religious freedoms are much weaker in the Middle East than in the rest of the OIC and certainly the rest of the world. Autocracy is the norm. At the moment, there is the single democracy in the region. There are a few electoral autocracies, but they're certainly not democracies. 28% of the people in the region would emigrate if given the chance. Now, this is a very high number relative to the world. Many of them, of course, want to leave because of for economic reasons, but persecution and religious persecution is among the reasons. There are various forms of illiberalism that that push people out. Now, these patterns that I just mentioned are documented and they're quantified in a book that is coming out as Adam pointed out a little while ago, that will be coming out soon. I'm going to be drawing on the religious freedoms chapters of this book, but you'll get a feel for the entire book, because I will draw on other parts as well. Since the basic question is the absence of a liberal variant of Islam, let me be more specific on religious freedoms. What do religious freedoms entail? Well, they entail freedom from government interference on whether one practices a religion, and if one practices a religion, which one and how one practices it. The freedom not to have a religion and to be open about this, not be irreligious privately and in secret, and the freedom from social controls on religion, social pressures that make one falsify one's religious preferences. On all these counts, the Middle East is repressive relative to the world and including the rest of OIC. Religious freedom also encompasses the freedom to reinterpret one's religion and to break away from one's religion, forming another variant, either forming another or possibly another religion. Being able to participate in a religious schism is central to religious freedoms. Now, all monotheisms have had schisms. Christianity started as a breakaway Jewish sect. Islam emerged in the 610s. Half a century later, there was a schism, the Sunni Shia division that of course you hear about now. The year 1054 saw a schism within Christianity. The western part of Europe started following a Rome-based variant of Christianity. The eastern part followed Orthodox Christianity, which is based in Constantinople, which is, of course, today's Istanbul. Eastern Europe saw, and of course, there was a Protestant Reformation, and within Protestantism, there have been innumerable schisms since. In Eastern Europe, Judaism has saw two quite notable schisms in the 19th century. Orthodox Judaism emerged as a stricter variant of mainline East European Judaism, and reform, so it was a stricter variant in the sense that they wanted people to follow religious rules more strictly, not to get assimilated, not to socialize with Gentiles and so on, wear dress that distinguished them from others. Reform Judaism emerged around the same time as a schism in the opposite direction. As a more liberal variant of Judaism, they found the rules of mainline Judaism to be too strict. They wanted to be accepted into Gentile society. The cost of not being part of mainstream society was rising at a time of increasing economic opportunities. They wanted permissiveness in diet. They wanted to do business on the Sabbath. They wanted to dress like others. They wanted their sermons to be in the vernacular rather than in Hebrew, which they didn't want to learn apart from a few prayers. In modern times, Islam has seen many schisms demanding more strictness. So ISIS is one. ISIS punished by death out conversion or any signs of converting out or moving away from ISIS. People were beheaded for heresy. Their goal was to have everyone live like Muslims in 7th century Arabia at the time that Islam emerged. In Egypt, a century earlier, the Muslim Brotherhood emerged as a pan-Islamic movement, wanted to put Islam at the center of life. It advocated greater strictness in enforcing Islamic rules, or at least its understanding of Islamic rules, than the Islam that the Egyptian state was promoting. This brings us back to our central puzzle. Why are there no liberal counterparts to the Muslim Brotherhood or ISIS? Now, certainly, when you look at Muslims around the world and Muslim organizations around the world, you do see centers of Islamic thought. So there's the Minaret of Freedom, but just to give examples from the United States, in Maryland, there's Zaytuna College in California. There are many others. These are small outfit. There are books that have been published that advocate a liberal, softer, more permissive form of Islam. I'm illustrating 3 on screen by Soroush, an Iranian, Akyol, a Turk, and by An-Naim, who is Sudanese. Now, all of these books promote a liberal, more tolerant, and more permissive form of Islam with free exit. In other words, absolutely no punishment for leaving the religion if it no longer suits your preferences. They all have the authors, such as the ones I'm giving as examples. They have admirers, they have followers in educated circles, but none is the founder of an organized school of thought. That none of them has influence remotely comparable to Hassan al-Banna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, or al-Baghdadi, who was the first caliph, the first leader of ISIS. Millions of Muslims, ordinary Muslims, are tolerant of religious diversity in daily life, but they haven't formed any organized movement. There's no Islamic counterpart yet to either Protestantism or Reform Judaism. Now, let's not confuse liberals with secularists. Secularists like Ataturk of Turkey, Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia, and the Pahlavi Shahs of Iran. All of them found Islam to be stultifying in various respects. They all had a very low opinion of Islamic rituals and of many teachings, common teachings, and they flaunted their disdain of traditional Islam. Ataturk was very fond of ballroom dancer. He was known to be a terrific dancer, and he insisted that all his ministers and the generals in the army and so on, they come to his weekly parties, and that they bring their wives in gowns, and he wanted them to learn ballroom dancing, and he wanted to see them all dancing. Many of them, both the men and the women, didn't want to do this. Some of them found it offensive. Nonetheless, they participated in it. Bourguiba also was very condescending toward Islam until the last 10 years of his rule. He called the Islamic fast. We're at the very end of the month of Islamic fasting, as I pointed out. He considered it archaic, and in fact, he made a point of insulting people who were fasting. One day, he went on live television with a big glass of orange juice at a time when people were fasting, and he slowly sipped it, and he had this played over and over and over again on government-controlled television, and this was clearly a way of provoking and of mocking the pious Egyptians. This was a premeditated act. The Pahlavis instituted what is known as an unveiling decree in 1936. They prohibited women from covering their hair, and they had a sort of religious police that did the opposite of what Iran's religious police is doing now. They actually, if they saw a woman who was in public spaces, was veiled, they actually they pulled the veil from her. So these leaders did succeed in secularizing daily life coercively as needed. And I've given you two examples of coercion. They did succeed in pushing Islam out of daily life, at least for a while. Now, you might expect them to have facilitated exits from Islam when they had a great deal of power. You might think that they would have promoted a radical reinterpretation of Islam. You might think that they would broaden religious freedoms to make it easier for people not to practice this religion that they were so critical of. But no, they did not liberalize Islam. They made Islam easy to ignore. They made it easier to be irreligious. In fact, they made it an advantage to be irreligious because you were more likely to be hired if you were looking for a government job, get into a plum school, and so on. Resistors were persecuted as backward. There was a climate of fear that was created with respect to religion. Public discourses got cleansed of religious references. So religious repression changed character. Before these secularist movements, secularists had to be very careful. They felt compelled to appear religious. Now the direction of religious preference falsification changed character. Now, to be fair to these secularist leaders, they considered their illiberal policies transitional. Why? Because they were under the influence of modernization theory, which was developed in the West, which essentially said that as societies get more educated, they become less religious. So they expected religiosity to decline anyway. They were simply speeding up a process that was going to take place. They all promoted secular education. They expected worldviews to be secularized, and eventually repression would be unnecessary. The key point is that secularizers in the Middle East were not liberals, and in fact secularists in the Middle East today are not necessarily liberals, though some definitely are. So our question remains on the table: why many major Islamic schisms occurred for greater strictness and none for more freedoms. Why is this? Why do we see this asymmetry? It's not that Islam is not dynamic, it's that the dynamism in the 20th century and now in the 21st century has worked in terms of the creation of new variants of Islam. It has worked in one direction alone. So let's approach our puzzle then from a new angle. Are there conflicts among Muslims that might generate a demand for a liberal form of Islam? Well, there are multitudes of divisive issues on which there is a substantial demand for liberalization. One of the prominent flashpoints is gender and the family. So Islam, under many interpretations, many dominant interpretation, requires women to dress modestly, prohibits mixed gender gatherings, except under social gatherings, except among members of the family. It restricts female mobility. Child marriage is allowed, if not sometimes promoted in some countries. Now, what is right and what is wrong is beside the point. Of course, the defenders of traditional positions do have their own rationales. My goal here is simply to describe the range of issues on which there is major disagreement, and where there is a liberal side, there's a side that wants relaxation. Certainly on gender and family issues, there are major constituencies that want relaxation in one direction, want rules to be relaxed, if not changed altogether, and certain prohibitions, like prohibitions on the restrictions on female mobility, to simply be abandoned for Islam to be interpreted in a way that equalizes genders. There's lots of opposition to existing rules that we pick up in anonymous surveys and also field work. Many Islamic rituals are contentious. Let me give you as an example the call to prayer 5 times a day that you hear in a Muslim society. You will hear from minarets. Well, today it's possible to get the call to prayer on a cell phone. There are apps that will give you the call to prayer. The time changes from one day to the next. There are apps that will give this to you. There are people, substantial numbers of people, who say, why do we need the call to prayer to be blasted from minarets when people we have the technology to give people this information in a way that doesn't disturb others. There are in Islam, there are many exceptions to the Ramadan fasting requirement. Pregnant women don't have to fast. If you have an illness that like diabetes that requires you to eat at certain times, again, you're excused from fasting, and is formally excused from fasting. There are also restaurants in many countries that are willing to serve people during Ramadan. Why, many liberals ask, why do restaurants close during Ramadan fasting hours? Why don't we take measures that will enable them to stay open. Well, it's usually, if it's not the government regulation, it's social pressures that keep restaurants closed. The role of religion in politics is a vast area of disagreement. There are people who object to using taxpayer funds to finance muftis, the interpreters of the officials who issue fatwas or religious opinions. In recent years, we've seen opinions issued in the name of Islam, that running an online business is sinful, cryptocurrency is sinful, celebrating the Gregorian New Year's is sinful, building a snowman, one that was issued in I believe it was in Iraq, where it's not even, where snow isn't usually an issue. Building a snowman was declared as illegal, or sinful. What is the logic that people would start worshiping idols, and snowmen would become idols? Anyway, there are many such religious opinions that are issued by people who are paid by the state, and there's a large constituency that objects to these types of opinions. The main point is that there's no shortage of issues on which substantial numbers of Muslims want more discretion, less religious controls. There are constituencies for a liberal variant of Islam. Now, some scholars will say, well, Islam is resistant to schisms because Islamic teachings treat Islam, the global Muslim community, as indivisible. But if so, why are there so many states? So many, are Muslims divided in so many states? The OIC has 56 members. Within countries, there are divisions among political parties. Turkey is about to have elections in 24 days. There are 40 parties that are participating at one level or another, not necessarily nationally, sometimes regionally. They run from communist parties, ethnic nationalist, conservative parties, to Islamist parties. There are also liberal parties. There's a small liberal party. There are green parties also. Iraq has, the last time I checked, had 58 political parties, all recognized, operating legitimately. So evidently Muslims are not immune to fragmentation. Significantly, that there are differences across parties on the social, among these parties, on the social role of religion. So the doctrine of an undivided Muslim community can't explain the absence of religious splintering on the liberal side. But widespread discontent, like, and I gave you some examples of specific issues, widespread discontent within a religious community need not generate disunion. If the personal costs of participating in a disunion or siding with people who want to leave the religion or establish a new variant of the religion, if the cost of doing that is too high, or the expected cost of doing that is too high, you will stick with the status quo. You won't stick your neck out. A successful schism requires collective action under leaders who are able to strategize and coordinate moves and provide unifying themes. There are certainly liberalizing movements that we see. Millions of people, after Mahsa Amini was killed under torture, millions of Iranians poured into the streets, including conservative Iranians, and this was a women-led movement, though many men also participated. For months, they filled the streets, they protested, but they were not sufficiently organized for lasting success. Illiberals are organized, and this is one of the challenges. So let's pursue this asymmetry. Why are liberals not organized? Well, a major reason is the fear of being accused of apostasy or blasphemy or heresy. This constrains discourse. It prevents people even from coming out and raising the question of establishing a liberal form of Islam. Now, it's unclear that Islam calls for temporal punishment of people who leave Islam. This is controversial. Some interpreters of the Quran will tell you that will point out that the Quran talks about punishment, but doesn't say when the punishment is going to occur. The default is punishment in the afterlife. Nevertheless, the notion that temporal punishment is needed set in early on during the first century of the religion, and what matters here is that there are popular counter-interpretations of the Quran that do require earthly punishment. Iran subscribes to this. ISIS subscribes to this. They block even discussions on freedom to exit, liberalizing the religion in terms of allowing people, if they're not happy with Islam, to switch to another religion, or openly declare themselves, say, as atheists. But a shift in the dominant interpretation is not unthinkable. The dominant interpretation on religious freedoms can change without giving up Islam's scriptural foundations. It can happen within Islam itself. Analogous transformations have taken place in other religions. Islam itself has been repeatedly reinterpreted, and very radically in modern times. For example, Islam has no concept, traditional Islamic law has no concept of corporation. What's a corporation? It's an organization that is treated as a natural person under the law. It has an indefinite lifespan, so the University of Wisconsin is a corporation, is a charitable nonprofit corporation. Apple is a corporation, is a for-profit corporation. The corporations are commonplace in the Middle East now. Everywhere, in every Muslim community, and no one objects to the corporation on religious grounds. Evidently, there's no absolute barrier to broad Islamic religious freedom. So we're back then to the fear factor. Fears of giving religious offense inhibit coming out, and if people don't come out, you don't have free discussion, you just have huge constituencies that want more freedoms, but this remains under the surface. But this is approximate reason. Christianity had illiberal periods. Remember the Inquisition and all the people who died at the stake for heresy, for blasphemy, apostasy. If Christianity liberalized, why haven't liberal variants of Islam emerged? We need to explore why, for centuries, collective action has been missing for liberalization, for an Islamic schism in the liberal direction. Well, an important difference is between liberal and illiberal-minded Muslims is that only liberals use coercion. So liberal-minded people are easily victimized, and they cannot fight back. But again, if you think of the history of Christianity, the other very large religion, large monotheism in the world, The critics of the Church of Rome were in the same boat. Ultimately, they did get organized. They did start defending themselves. They formed armies. There was a schism that was won through violent struggles. Opponents of illiberal Islam are not even organized, let alone armed. Here's a key point. Organizational weaknesses are not simply a function of fear. Civic life is weak generally, and this is something you see in the bar graph here. What the bars capture is the share of people in these three groups of societies that participate in politics or have participated in politics over the last year. So this could be joining civic organizations, protesting, lobbying, participating in public campaigns, and so on. You can see in the Middle East, the share is a little over a third as opposed to 60% of the world generally. Private organizational capacity is low for historical reasons, not just because of fears of consequences today. Until the 1800s, private perpetual organizations with a political purpose could not be formed under the law at the time, under Islamic law. And that has huge implications for the present. There was no institutional basis for forming organizations with a political agenda. Let me explain. In the pre-modern Middle East, private organizations existed. They were known as waqfs. Waqf was a trust that an individual formed to provide services in perpetuity according to his or her stipulations. It's like establishing a college fund that will be run by a trustee whose purpose is to educate a particular student. These waqfs supplied services that in Western Europe were provided through corporations that had autonomy. Colleges and universities in Western Europe were established as corporations. Madrasas, their Islamic equivalent, were established as waqfs. Churches were organized as corporations, mosques as waqfs. Waqfs could be established to supply anything allowed under Islamic law. Here's an example from Cairo. There's a waqf that had a water fountain on the bottom floor, and on top there was a school. Along the Silk Road from the Aegean all the way into Central Asia, into parts of China, including Xinjiang, that is on the news one camel day apart, you will see inns like this. They were established by private entrepreneurs to provide services to merchants. Now, waqfs controlled vast resources. They could have used their enormous wealth to constrain the state and advance the freedoms of their constituents. They could have decentralized power and led to liberalization in the Middle East. However, the waqfs remained politically powerless. Why? Because they were run not according to the preferences of the trustees, not according to the preferences of the beneficiaries of the waqfs, the people who would use the water fountain, the merchants who would use the inn. They were run according to the preferences of the founder, even years later. They could not have even tried to constrain the state because the rules of the waqf precluded political participation in any way. They were established to provide a political service, and it wouldn't have been legitimate to provide, try to create political checks and balances. In places much farther along than the Middle East in liberalization and democratization, the process has varied. You look at Holland and France and England, you see quite big differences in the process, but these patterns all have a common element, which is that they involve organized struggles between private associations, whether universities, cities, religious orders, guilds, and the state. All of them are organized as corporations. They challenged power structures, they created ideologies. So a virtuous circle emerged in Western Europe. You got a strong civil society strengthened. It put greater restrictions on the state, and those restrictions then provided more room for private, for civil organizations. In the Middle East, there was a vicious circle. The weak civil society didn't provide constraints on the state, and this limited then the advance of the freedoms and perpetuated autocracy. There's one more point to it, and then I will wrap up. It wasn't just problems stemming from the Waqfs. Commercial institutions embedded in Islamic law prevented scaling up of profit-making enterprises. They limited the pooling of capital, the longevity of commercial organizations, and the complexity of organizations. The details here are in a previous book called The Long Divergence. In a nutshell, several elements of Islamic law contributed to keeping Middle Eastern enterprises structurally stagnant till the 1800s, and this had an important political effect, which is that you didn't get large merchants with the power, with a lot of capital and the power to constrain the state. You didn't get business associations because businesses were very short-lived. Now, why is this relevant to our puzzle, the absence of a liberal variant of Islam? Private economic actors want stronger property rights. They want to constrain rulers, if nothing else, for predictability. They want to free themselves from inefficient rules, and many inefficient rules have religious components. They want to constrain religion as well. In Western Europe, liberalization, wherever you look, the liberalization path involved merchants and big enterprises. To the 19th century, Middle East entrepreneurs did not form movements to constrain the state in any way or to constrain clerics. So the long unavailability of means of forming large and perpetual organizations, whether for-profit or not-for-profit, this contributed to keeping civil society weak. And so in the 21st century, Middle Eastern entrepreneurs can now form huge companies. There were reforms in the 19th century that allowed it. A moment ago I said you can form corporations in the Middle East now. You can form large organizations. People's menu of organizations is not limited to Islamic templates. The Islamic Waqf is also defunct, yet across the Middle East, civil society remains weak. Civic life is anemic. Why? Well, a century is too short a time for people to develop the skills of operating efficient, effective civic organizations. The region is learning, but the region has spent 100 years so far trying to learn what European countries that liberalized and democracies learned in over 1,000 years through many struggles. The region's In addition, because civic society, so civic life is weak, civil society is weak, rulers are able to rule autocratically. And they try systematically, they're threatened by civil society, they try to keep civil society weak. It's this vicious circle that I mentioned that continues. And rulers are also threatened by a liberal Islamic schism. They might welcome it in their hearts, but they fear the political instability it would bring, so they don't encourage it, they don't undermine it. So, final slide. I said at the beginning that the glass is not empty, and I've talked a lot about the empty parts, but I have not said this book could have been titled Freedoms Denied. I haven't said that. I've said freedoms delayed, because a lot of these developments of the reforms that have replaced Islamic institutions with modern institutions through transplants from other countries, mainly the West, have created the legal infrastructure for a strengthening civil society. So there is, and remember that there's no absolute barrier to reinterpreting Islam. You can do this within, staying within Islamic doctrines, remaining and using principles that in the Quran and in Islamic traditions. That's what these various authors, I showed you several books. That is exactly what they do. It's not to say that there's a quick fix. It's not to say that we're going to see democratization, that it's going to be an Arab Spring that will stay as an Arab Spring in the near future. No, many patterns have to change, and this is going to be a long process, but the region does not have to start from scratch. The institutions needed to create a civil society and to balance the state, which is what you need. You need checks and balances for democratization, to preserve freedoms, to establish and preserve freedoms. You don't have to start from scratch. The societies of the Middle East are gradually learning how to use these organizations. They're increasing their trust in impersonal organizations, associations is increasing. So there is reason to be optimistic over the longer run, though not immediately. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll read a question or two that's come up from the audience, and then we'll afterwards head over for the reception that we have in Whittick. So first question, someone asked, would efforts from the West, whether Muslims or others, to create a liberal schism of Islam work, or would it create further problems due to the anger against the West from groups like ISIS?
So it's a good question. I think if the West tries to coercively try to change it, I think it will generate a backlash. Trust in the West is quite low for historical reasons. The West colonized most of the region, so this wouldn't work. Now, on the other hand, there is a large Muslim diaspora in many countries, primarily in Europe and but also North America, and we see small liberal outfits emerging, and these may actually end up generating schisms within Europe. Possibly, my guess, this would happen with the next generation. But that's where a liberal schism can start. They're also promising Islam is less repressive, more tolerant generally outside the Middle East. In Indonesia, you have much larger shares of people who would like to liberalize. So a schism can occur in Indonesia. I think it's more likely to occur outside of the Middle East, which is the most repressive part of the Muslim world. Once it starts there, of course, like any religion, it can spread, especially if constituencies already exist in other places.
Thank you. So another question, a couple people ask something similar to this. Can you speak to the effects that autocratic governments have on economic outcomes of those who live under their rule?
So yes. Autocracies harm economic growth generally because they're quite suspicious of innovations, and they scare away the most talented, potentially most innovative people. There's a huge brain drain out of the Middle East, so they're harmful in that way. They harm growth also by dividing society and playing favorites in Turkey, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, so the Gulf countries, Tunisia. Increasingly, people who have connections with the government are favored, and others are not. Contracts tend to go to people with connections to the government. In Turkey, it has been people who, at least outwardly, show that they are aligned religiously with the government. This, of course, leads to a lot of inefficiencies because contracts don't go to the best people, the people who offer to do the work for the best work for the least amount of money. They go to cronies, and cronyism then leads to more corruption. When people see that the system is rotten, they feel justified in being corrupt themselves. So, if you look at countries that have moved from democracy to autocracy in the Middle East, this would be Tunisia recently. Turkey would be another example. They just become increasingly corrupt. Not in Turkey's case, not in the first few years, but eventually, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and Turkey has diminished, has fallen greatly in the Transparency International Index, which is an index of the degree of corruption. Every year that after Erdogan's, the current president's first 4 or 5 years, every year Turkey has fallen, has become more corrupt according to the indices. Yeah.
Yeah, so do one more question then. So since freedom is delayed, does this imply a stronger liberal presence is in sight for regions, inside of regions such as the Kurdish people of northern Iraq and Turkey? And if so, what is a good expectation of time for progress in these areas? Or is this an imposed Western expectation?
So freedoms are, many freedoms are linked to each other. They support each other. So if religiously the region becomes freer, it's going to become intellectually freer as well, because religion is among the factors that constrains intellectual discourse. If intellectuals feel freer to express themselves, they are going to they're going to form organizations that promote ethnic rights where ethnic groups are oppressed. Uh, there, so uh, so I'm hopeful that we are going to see advances in the region. I think that it's going to start with religious liberalization. It will probably come from outside the region. If it occurs within the region, it will probably be religious liberalization that starts in either Turkey or Iran. And when that happens, other freedoms will advance as well. The other possibility within the Arab world, I think in the Gulf, though I'm more pessimistic than the rest of the world with regard to the Arab world, places where you do have a merchant class emerging, you may see sustained movements to constrain the autocracies. And this would probably happen when oil money runs out and they start, and everything is, the opponents of the regime, opponents of the ruling family cannot be bought off as easily as they can. This is how these regimes have maintained power so far. But I don't think any of these things are happening soon.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to
Thank
our
you.
speaker.
Thank you very much.
For all the students, if you didn't swipe in on your way in, if you could make sure you swipe your ID card, or if you didn't bring it, we also have a sign-in sheet. And again, we have a reception over in Whittick Hall. And if you're interested in learning about what other events and opportunities we have coming up, these are social media for the MFI.